Welcome to the Grimfrost Podcast. Today's guest is Anders Kaliff, author and professor of archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. So, Anders, welcome to our longhouse here at Grimfrost.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So, how was your journey? Most of our guests, they take the train, but you actually drove here.
I drove here from Uppsala, but it was very smooth actually.
Yeah.
Good road, not much traffic. So.
Because winter driving in Sweden can be a real pain in the ass.
Yeah, but I think it was a lovely day.
All right.
The sun in Karlstad, that is an expression. So.
Yeah. So you're a professor of archaeology. Where and how did your interest start in the first place?
Very far back in childhood, actually. Depending on some different things, really. I grew up in the countryside in southern Östergötland, one of the Swedish provinces, and in a mainly rural area where most of my ancestors also had lived for a very long time, or at least on one side. It was a lot of stories about old things that I love to listen to old people, my grandparents and others who actually were telling such stories. So that, I think, was the earliest thing. And then I also had a very good teacher, unfortunately only for 1 year when I was in fourth grade in school. Then he left. But he was an excellent history and storyteller about historic things. So that also drew. So I know I first when I was 9-10 years old, I actually said I wanted to be an archaeologist or an historian. Then, yeah.
And Östergötland, of course, south of Stockholm, has a very rich history, Swedish history. Like there's a lot of archaeology in Östergötland in the first place.
A lot of archaeology, like the Rökstone that I saw also as a child, and a lot of other things. So I was interested, of course, in the Vikings. I think every kid, or at least boy in those days, were more or less interested in the Viking age. And I was very interested, as also many children, boys, in the history of war, like the 30 Years' War and Gustavus Adolphus and Carlos XII and other things like that. So it was not particularly archaeology, but history and the old times in general.
So was that like? So how was? Did you know very early that you want to do archaeology, or did you grow into that?
No, I actually knew that, but when I was a teenager and in the upper teen years, I actually also did other things. I started to study physics and chemistry on university, but I quite soon returned to archaeology, and actually I worked at my first excavation as 15 years old. So that was in the autumn of 78. So it's starting to get long time ago.
Okay.
And then I worked for the Heritage Board, National Heritage Board, when I was still in school then, but in the autumn of 78 at the Urnfield burial site from Bronze Age. And that was, strangely enough, the things that I was more or less starting my academic research with much later then, because Bronze Age and early Iron Age burials, burial customs, and was the starting point for a lot of things I have developed later.
Yeah, because nowadays one of your specialities is the ancient Indo-Europeans and how they connect with Scandinavia. So who were the Indo-Europeans? Like, can you tell us a little bit about your interest for that first off?
For the Indo-Europeans, yes, of course, and that goes quite long back also. When I first started as an archaeologist in the 1980s, I worked as a field archaeologist in the National Heritage Board for quite many years, and I worked abroad also in different places. Then gradually I started to get interested in research, and I always had a feeling that migration was quite important for the spread of culture during different periods in prehistory. But in the 1980s and also 90s, it was quite unpopular in Swedish archaeology to discuss migration as a force behind cultural spread. I was and that is quite interesting, and it's always easy to say I was right all along the way, but actually in the 1980s, late 1980s, when I suggested a PhD project in Uppsala University for one of the teachers in those days, I said I would like to study the battle axe culture, the corded ware culture, Swedish stridsyxekultur as caused by a migration from the steppes in the east. That was an old interpretation from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then my to-be supervisor said, no, don't suggest that. That's an obsolete thought. You shouldn't. It will ruin your possibilities to make an archaeological career in any case. So you shouldn't do that. And I didn't. And in the long run, I'm quite happy I got that advice. Now I know that it should have been really the right angle on that subject, but it took almost or more than 25 years to reach that point in the paradigm of archaeology. So
how come you're happy that you got that advice? I mean, for me, it sounds like you kind of wanted to do that, but you had to wait 25 years.
Yeah, I actually, other persons did that much later due to DNA research and things that we will probably discuss a little later here. It's also relevant for the Indo-Europeans, but I thought it must be something behind that. Now that I'm happy, it's because I know that if I had started with that, I would have been stopped along the way to do other things because it was so unpopular. So I'm happy that I started from another point of view, but also in directions that led me to the Indo-Europeans, and that was studying the burial customs of the Bronze Age, early Iron Age, southern Scandinavia. There's a lot of similarities with broader areas in Northern Europe, but that was also a way to study rituals and beliefs that were, as it turned out, very, very significant for the early Indo-Europeans that, of course, originated in the steppes in the east. That has been actually suggested a long time ago, but that has shown to be actually a realistic scenario.
Yeah, so that leads me a little bit to the question I kind of jumped the gun on a little bit. But who were the Indo-Europeans?
Yeah, the Indo-Europeans, as we know today, it's a people actually living in the steppe regions of Eastern Europe, Western Asia, the Pontic steppe. That's the area north of the Caspian and the Black Sea in today's Ukraine and southern part of Russia, the steppe areas there. And it's called the Yamnaya culture that was present there from little more than 5,000 years ago and until a little less than 5,000 years ago. And around 3,000 BC, 5,000 years ago, it started to migrate rapidly, actually, towards Europe and also far away back to the beyond the Ural Mountains and back onto the borders of today's China, actually, in the east also. And this happens in less than a century. So in less than a century, they moved from the Pontic steppe to today's Jutland and also the western coast of today's France and also to parts of Scandinavia. And that is clearly shown by ADNA research, the possibility that has developed in the later years to detect the DNA of long gone people, also the people living 5,000 years ago then. And this was rediscovered, so to speak, because this scenario was actually suggested more than 100 years ago also by archaeologists, that this was the cause of the battle axe culture and also the spread of Indo-European languages. But this was rediscovered in 2015 when two very, very credible articles that was published at the same time in the journal Nature, that's the science journal Nature, from two DNA research teams, one with center in Harvard in the States and one in Copenhagen, that actually showed the same thing, hundreds of samples that could show that this scenario was the correct one. And then it's all history, because the development the last 9-10 years has shown much more of this, and also in details.
Yeah. Do they know why the migration started in the first place?
That is, as one says, a very good question, and it's still debated very much. There is a lot of suggestions, but there are some theories that are more credible than others, I think. One is that they were semi-nomadic herding people, so they had recently domesticated the horse, not mainly for riding in this early time, actually, because they also hunted the horse. So they probably domesticated horses to draw other horses to the flock, so to speak. But they also managed to ride, and they probably used that for herding cattle and sheep and different animals.
And of course, then they learn to cover bigger distances.
Yes, because if you are on horseback, you could cover much larger areas, have larger herds, larger flocks of animals, and then you could expand. But there is another thing also in it, and I think we will discuss that more, because I've written about the so-called Koryos, that is the reconstructed Indo-European word for it. It's men in arms or warriors.
So we'll come back to that a little bit later, of course. But like who were the people living in Europe before the Indo-Europeans came then? Because I mean, obviously there were people here.
Yeah. Well, of course, it has been people in Europe, also Northern Europe, since the ice left, and that's more than 10,000 years ago then. So also in Scandinavia, and we have mainly three different populations. If you take the large picture, first you got the hunter-gatherer population, that's from the early Stone Age, and they are actually two, because it's coming one group very far east, northeast, coming along or more or less the northern part of Siberia and up to northern Scandinavia, mixing with another group that come from the south, down from the areas of the cave paintings and such things in Altamira and Lascaux in France and Spain. They come up along the western coast of Europe and up to Scandinavia. And then in Scandinavia, they mix to the Scandinavian hunter-gatherer group, so western hunter-gatherer and eastern hunter-gatherer. So that's the first group that is populating Scandinavia. And then when agriculture arrives, and then we are around 6,000 years ago to Scandinavia, it has gradually come from the southeast through Europe. And that's with a completely new group of people coming from today's Anatolia, Syria, Anatolia, today's Turkey and Syria, more or less. And they are gradually coming with agriculture through the Balkans and also through Southern Europe and up through to Central Europe and up to Northern Germany. Then they stop for around 1,000 years before they also go into Scandinavia around 6,000 years ago. So that's another big population. That was also a surprise when that was detected around 2009-10. Lot debates in archaeology, but that's another story than we are covering today, I think. But then in the long run, they mix with the earlier hunter-gatherers, but that takes quite a long time, actually. For 1,000 years, they live as separate groups, more or less. And then this possibly Indo-European. Of course, we can't say the language, but that are a lot of other indications that shows that it is the language coming with them. That group comes in also then around 5,000 years ago, a little less. And they also eventually mix with the earlier. So today, Scandinavian population, if you have your roots in Scandinavia, you have more or less the three parts mixed in your genes.
So was it like a peaceful migration, or were there a lot of conflicts? You already mentioned the Koreans and the war clans, basically.
Yes, that is also a very, very tricky question to answer, give a decisive answer to, because if you go back to earlier research, long before the DNA, in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was the general idea that the Indo-Europeans came as warlike people. They conquered Europe, more or less, and the battle axe people that were connected to it, more or less accurately, as we can say today, they were interpreted as riding people with the battle axes coming and, of course, killing the old population. We can't say today that there is a lot of evidence for a lot of violence. There are evidence of violence, but not in that. So you can actually say that they were some sort of conquering people like that, and that is not really very probable, because it was not a state attacking another state like that. It was people moving. But there is one indication how things could have developed, and that is because these Yamnaya people, they are the first carriers of the Yersinia pestis bacteria, the classical plague, bubonic plague, and also lung plague that has caused the Justinian plague and the medieval Black Death and other things, and been harassing the humanity since then. And this was the first time when that was developed into a really bad disease. So it's possible that it actually killed a lot of people of the old European population. So they actually could move in with their the animal flocks more or less in a area that was not so densely populated longer. But that is, of course, only one interpretation.
Yeah.
But it was probably or possibly a combination of different factors, where this Koreus, this very special group of young warriors that were significant for the Indo-European people and has been for actually all of history since, more or less. And the Koreus, they were a group of young men that were initiated into society as full-grown men, and also who later had the possibility to make their family of their own and live their life in society. But for a few years, they lived outside society as armed persons under special leaders, and also in a more or less lawless state, where they had the role to expand the tribe's area, conquering other tribes, taking their animals, and
so
also,
that would also be like a part of their expansion.
That could really be one major factor behind why they were expansive, and also for a possibly violent way to expand the territories.
So I guess you already touched upon this a little bit, but I wanted to get back to this because I think it's a kind of an important question. I feel we didn't really explain it enough, but most Europeans do not share a common ancestral group, right? There are, like, as you said, there are many different.
There are different, yes. In all of Europe, actually, mainly that's three different, but it differs if you go from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. If you go down to Southern Italy and Sardinia, particularly Sardinia, there you have more or less the preserved DNA from the first agriculturalists coming from the Levant.
So is DNA the main reason we know this, or are there any other archaeological finds, or
It's actually a lot of other finds, and that is also why this interpretation is actually not so new as it sounds today, because if you look at the interpretations of the things I now was discussing, you could read very much the same if you read archaeological work from the 1920s. The famous British-Australian archaeologist Gordon Childe, who was active in the first half of the 20th century, He wrote in 1927 a very important book about the, as he called, Aryan people. We could also touch later what Aryans was. And that was, of course, the Indo-Europeans in this case. And he actually, in 1927, more or less gave us the same view of this expansion as also archaeologists nowadays, once again, paint together with linguists and also historians of religion, because there is a lot of evidence that put together give a very, very I wouldn't say detailed, but very rich picture of how this actually was happening, and what kind of cultural features that also followed these people.
So DNA, in a sense, the new DNA technology is mainly just confirming these old theories, or like these almost century-old theories that's been around.
Yes, actually, the Indo-European thinks that it actually starts with linguistics. It's a linguistic concept, because Indo-European, we talk of Indo-European languages, and Swedish is one of them, of course, together with German, English, French, the Slavic languages, but also like the ancient Indian Sanskrit, that is also Hindi and Urdu today is from the same root, and also the Persian language, the Iranian language, and the Greek, and also Latin originally. So it's a lot of, and all these languages have a lot of things in common that must go back to original language that they all have as an ancestor then far way back. And if you look at it linguistically, and you see when this, because there are linguistic models how fast language is changing in different environments, and if you count on that as a linguist, I'm not a linguist myself, but I work a lot with linguists, and then you actually are placed in the same time span when this Yamnaya expansion happened then 5,000 years ago. And the linguists, they have never left this scenario, because this developed already in the late 18th century with a person that his name is William Jones. He was actually a colonial servant in India, in British India, in the late 1700s, and he was actually the first person. He was not a scientist, but he from the beginning, but he actually saw similarities between the Indian ancient Sanskrit and also European languages, not least Latin, and also Greek, ancient Greek, and also such languages like Lithuanian and Russian and others. And from that on, the Indo-European research in linguistics started. And during the 1800s, 19th century, then also historians of religion saw the same traits in the different religions that were belonging to Indo-European speaking people.
Yeah, because you've done a lot of research about like cosmology and religion.
Yeah, yes.
Of the Indo-Europeans, and how has it influenced like Norse mythology? Because I mean, we dabble a lot in Viking history. That's our main interest, I guess. But what can you tell us about that?
Yes, of course. As you know, the Norse mythology is written down relatively late in the medieval period, but it actually mirrors the Viking period, or even earlier with the Folnaldar saga and other things. They could be from the migration period, or even older, some of the themes. And even if it's late, it's actually considered by mythologists as it's a very, very rich material. And it's actually very, very similar to some of the other early Indo-European myths. You could see a lot of similarities between the ancient Indian mythology that is preserved in the today's Hindu myths, going back to the Rig Veda and other Vedic scripts that is actually more than 3,000 years old as tradition. Also in that case written down much later, but with a very long oral tradition that is also very conservative and preserves things very, very well. So you could see a lot of similarities, and the Scandinavian material is considered to be one of the richest and one actually of the best preserved.
Yeah, yeah. Because I find this very interesting, especially with the connection to India, and that we are actually connected to that mythologically. Because in Norse mythology, for instance, the world is created by Odin, Vilenve, dismembering the giant Ymir and creating the world. And in the Hinduism, they have a cosmic being called, I have to look at my paper, Purusha.
Purusha, yes. Yes.
So is there a connection between those?
Yes, definitely, I would say. And
because he suffers the same fate, basically.
He suffered the same fate. And of course, the world is created out of the body of these two primordial beings that is actually the basis for all of existence. And in both, in the Indic version, this Purusha, the cutting up of Purusha and creating of the world, that is actually the template for both sacrificial customs, sacrificial rituals, and also for mortuary rituals, how the cremation burial practice also today is carried out. I have had the privilege, I would call it myself at least, to see at least 70 cremations in Indian context in Nepal and India, and also interviewing people about how they do this and what is the beliefs behind it and so on, and of course read a lot about it also. And it's amazing to see that still today the things are carried out in accordance with the Rig Vedic version that is 3,000 years old. You could read the Rig Veda and see what is carried out in today's cremations. And the fire sacrifices of Hinduism today is also a Vedic relict that goes back to this. And the creation of the world is from this primordial being that is cut up, and the world is created. And when things are reversed, as when the body is dissolved by fire or in other ways, it's also possible, then everything goes back to creation again. So it's like a microcosm that is actually reversed. So the human and also sacrificial things that you sacrifice through fire or cutting up in other ways or dissolving in other ways, that is also put back into the creation. So that is also one of the main purposes with the sacrifice, that you should bring back the forces of creation to its origin.
Yeah. So that's super fascinating. But I'm actually even more curious about the correlations, because also the Norse gods, the Asar.
Yes,
they have a connection to Hinduism, if I'm not mistaken, through the Asura. Were they giants, or like they were? Yeah, they were giants, right?
Yeah, the Asura. Yes, it's very hard actually to make the comparisons as such. You could see that the Hindu gods, going back to the Vedic times also, they are partly the same, but they have changed names in some cases. But you can see that they have the same. Well, they are gods for different things in creation, for fertility, for wind, for war, and things that you also could see in the Nordic case. But in some cases, you have the names also that are very, very similar, like Wotan and Vata, Odin, for instance. But in some cases, it's also the names may have come to belong to other gods than the original one. So it's tricky to make direct connections sometimes with the names.
So do we? Obviously, I mean, they have gods with the same similar characteristics, then. But you mean that the names differ, or it's like for that the names can't be correlated, so to speak?
They can sometimes, and sometimes it's you have to be a linguist to see the correlations,
Oh,
because
okay.
they are quite tricky to see if you don't detect the linguistic developments, so to speak. But they are very often the same, basically, and goes back to words and names that could be reconstructed in as a proto or core Indo-European language that is, of course, not longer spoken, but
Yeah.
that is the possible origin of all of the Indo-European languages spoken today.
So, are there any other pre-Christian religious um, religions that originate from the Indo-Europeans then?
Yes, definitely. If you see the classical Greek and Latin myths, they are also very much the same. We could take, for instance, the Roman creation myth with Romulus and Remus, the twins that are brought up by the she-wolf, that is the emblem for ancient Rome also. They are actually a reflection of the so-called divine twins, that is from the beginning not two children like that, but they are becoming the kings of Rome, of course, so they are very, very important. But the divine twins, they go back to probably the earliest Indo-European sun religion and sun worship, or the mythology, how the sun was actually moving across the sky with the two horses driving it on a chariot that was, of course, driven by a charioteer. And the moon was also driven by another charioteer. So you have the divine twins with the horses, like we can see on the actually seat here at the table. They are preserved long up into folkloristic art, not least in Norway in much later time. But they are also reflected in the Romulus and Remus myth, interestingly enough, and like in the Dioscuri, the twin gods of the classical mythology also. You have them in many different variants in different Indo-European contexts. So, but that is only one. You have this primordial being cut up, and the world created out of his remains, that is also part of other mythologies.
Yeah.
But the Vedic, Hinduistic today then, as known as Hinduistic, even if the Vedic is really a little bit special, more like the old religion in Scandinavia, but still today preserved in today's religion. That is one of the more detailed preserved mythologies, together with the Scandinavian one. So it's often used by historians of religion to compare.
Because I always found like a similarity between Norse mythology and like the Greek and Roman mythology, but I always thought that they took a lot of inspiration from them. But would you say that rather that the Indo-European religion kind of spread in different angles?
Yes, if you had asked me 20 years ago, I also thought that there was a lot of inspiration maybe from connections to the classical cultures of Southern Europe, not least during the Roman times, when we know that the Germanic tribes, not least the Scandinavians, they had brought in a lot of know-how and also objects from the Roman Empire, serving in the Roman army as auxiliary troops and so on, not least. So they had a lot of things coming in, and I myself thought that it was a lot of inspiration then that could have made the similarities. But now I'm actually more about believing that the deep roots are much more important, actually. And some things were probably taken up by the Germanic people and the Norse later, just because they had similarities. So it was quite easy to apply them to the already existing beliefs and customs that you had, and rituals possibly.
So how did you come to that conclusion? Why did you, like, where did you realize that this might be the way?
it's really a lot of small things that is preserved very, very more or less up to our own time, actually, in folklore and in folk art and so on. Not only in Scandinavia, but very much in Scandinavia. If you look at southern Norway in Setesdal and Telemark and other such places where they have shares that is very much similar to this one, and not least beds and other things that you could see in the Viking art, like in the Oseberg find, but you also in much earlier things from the Bronze Age, and you can see them also in Slavonic people, where they have the same patterns and the same double horses. In today's Lithuania, still they put up the double horse on the houses to protect the houses. That also the divine twins. You have it, of course, in linguistic evidence also that is connected to these mythologies.
Yeah. So how far back can you trace a religion then? Like,
it depends on if you mean it in written sources, of course, because then it's not so very far in most cases. But if you look at the reconstruction in the same way as you reconstruct language, then that you have a lot of traces that covers similarities that has been separated for a very, very long time, then you could try to reconstruct it in more or less the same way as linguistic evidence. And of course, it would be possible that things were also similar because they had connections later. But when working in this Indo-European project, the language and myth of prehistory, that is called the LAMP project, that has been going on since 2020, where I'm one of two archaeologists, and there are historians of religion and mainly linguists also. I've looked more deeply into this, and the other archaeologist in this project, Terje Østegård, a Norwegian colleague working in Sweden nowadays, we have compared the places where our own ancestors come from mainly. He's from Setesdal in Norway, and I from southern Östergötland and northern Småland. Two quite relict areas when it comes to a lot of folkloristic stuff. And it's amazing with a lot of things how similar they are, not in ways that could be connected to later learned traditions that were coming from priests in the church or anything, but that goes very, very deep into certain things when it comes to perceptions about death and how people what happens after death, and how you do certain things during Christmas and other festivities during the year. Horse rituals, not least, because that is one thing that goes very far back. I'm quite convinced that.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of things that is taken one by one, not so convincing. But when you look at it all together, it broadens and makes a very, very much very convincing picture, I would say.
Yeah, because when you look at some of these like ancient religions that at least I know about, obviously there are going to be like similar gods, like, or at least gods who are connected to a few similar nature phenomenons, like Thor, obviously the god of thunder. You have Zeus, who throws arrows of lightning and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So how, obviously thunder and lightning must be like for us, obviously it's not a big mystery why it occurs, but for an ancient people, obviously it must feel like something divine. So wouldn't it be like, it would, I guess it wouldn't be like that far-fetched to imagine that the idea of a thunder god coming up like in different cultures. So how do you know that it is an actual relation that you can trace back, or rather than just they had the same thought?
Yeah, that's a good question, of course. And if you take one particular god like Thor, then he doesn't even have the linguistic similarities in all of the Indo-European. So that would be a case that would not be so convincing, because, as you say, it could be a phenomenology logical thing that is common human, that you interpret nature in those ways. But still, you have Thor possibly very far back in time. You have him possibly, as we discussed before, this also in the rock carvings from the Scandinavian Bronze Age, for instance. There are some interpretations that say that Thor's axe could be more or less the war hammer of the battle axe people also, that it goes very far back like that. But that is, of course, not a proof. So I think that Thor, if we would have been only Thor, we couldn't make this conclusion. But there is a lot of other things, like the giant Ymir and Purusha that we discussed earlier. And a lot of other things, like the horses, the horse sacrifices, the cremation ritual, the ritual fires, that would be much more convincing, taking all together. So, and then it suddenly is too much that is too similar to be only coincidence. It could be coincidence. It's always like that, but it's more probable. It's like the Occam razor. It's more probable that it is connected, actually, when you have all the other connections in the same time, the DNA, the linguistic things, and so on.
So, which gods are connected then? Like, which gods are the same? Are there too many to be mentioned, or like, give us some examples at least?
I think that Odin is a god that goes very far back. He is, of course, very disputed in the Scandinavian thing, because for some time he was considered a late god that was maybe brought in during the migration period or something. Okay. But he's probably very early, actually. And Wotan and Wotanas, it's the reconstructed old world, the Wotanas, that is the fury, or also the wind. There could be the fury of war, there could be the fury of nature. So it's probably very, very deep. That is one of them. A fertility god, but if his name was Frey, Frey is probably the lord, like Freya, the mistress, or the high goddess, like that. Is more epithet and not the name, maybe. So it could be hard with the names. But you have like Surya, the sun, more or less. The sun could have been very much important, because you have the same in the Vedic version, but that has dropped in importance in the Norse time, in the Viking time. So, but if you go to the Bronze Age religion, it might have been much more important also in Scandinavia. So you have a lot of things that are preserved, but they are not necessarily the most important if you go to later periods. Some of the earliest important gods, like possibly Tyr, the famous Norse god that is quite enigmatic in the Viking mythology. He has a place, but it's not very important. But Tyr is interpreted in history of religion and linguistically as the same word as the word for God in early Indo-European. It's the like Zeus in Greek.
Because as far as I remember, anyways, maybe I got this wrong, but I think you've written about Tyr being imported and Odin being like an old Scandinavian ruler of the gods. Do I remember that correctly, or?
I thought that I probably only quoted that because I've not actually dealt so much with the gods. It's more like the principles behind it, like what was, because I actually don't think that the gods as such were. They were probably important, but I think it was the forces behind what we are interpreting as gods in the quite late tradition that was the important thing. I'm not quite sure that they actually necessarily thought about them as personal gods in that way, because that could reflect very much the mythology that was written down also. But I mean, like Wotanas, Odin, with his very many aspects and very enigmatic approach, many names also, more than 200 in the. I mean, he's such an complex personality. So he in himself reflects almost all of religion. If you want, it wouldn't necessarily take any more God than Wotan or Odin, really. But we have others also. But we don't actually know whether one god of fertility was whether one goddess of fertility. The Heroes Gamos, the holy wedding, that seems to have been important if you look at depictions from different periods from the Bronze Age and onwards. And that could reflect a very important myth. But the things that has more interested me is what is it we trace in the burial custom, in the sacrificial custom that we see, regardless of if it was dedicated to Tyr or Odin or Freya or something like that. Because
many people see everything occurring in a culture as culturally original, I guess. Was that's almost never the case then, if I interpret you correctly. So that means that people don't really live in isolated community. They didn't live in isolated communities back then. In that sense,
the interesting thing is, if I always tell this to the students, because it's like the general idea, thinking briefly about prehistory, is that the further back in time you go, the more complicated communications were, because people were in small groups living in different areas. But if you go to the period, the 1,000 or maybe even 2,000 years directly after this Indo-European expansion 5,000 years ago, you had a vast area where people actually, to a large extent, talked and understood more or less the same language. It was originally the same language, the Proto-Indo-European or core Indo-European language, as we often say. And for quite a long time, it remained quite similar. I'm very much convinced that the large similarities you see all over Bronze Age Europe, or more or less all over Bronze Age Europe, that's mainly caused of that, actually. You could travel from middle Scandinavia down to southern Germany or France and speak more or less the same language, if you were in the right groups, at least. Of course, the other people were still living there, and things mixed also, because Scandinavian languages, for instance, the Germanic languages in general, they have a lot of remains also from it's believed from the pre-Indo-European languages that was spoken in these areas. When you go to the Celtic languages, they have originally very many similarities, but they have partly a different history than later. But it's only 2,000 years ago, a little more, and that's not that's quite a long time, I know. But then you can distinguish the Germanic languages. I mean, the overall German languages. But if you go only 1,000 years ago to the Viking Age, it was more or less the same language spoken in Scandinavia, for instance. It was not, as many believe, that it was harder to understand each other. So it was easier actually to travel to also interact in different cultural aspects, and also in trade and other things, if it goes to 3,000 years ago. And during the Bronze Age, you are in this very, very golden age when it comes to communication. So I think that is a key to why you see all these connections. And during that period, it was, of course, a first expansion that more or less brought the same language and also the same beliefs, the same customs over a large area.
Yes.
Some of that was preserved in all of the areas. But then, of course, later you also had the possibility to communicate and also spread other cultural goods over the same area.
Yeah. So would you say that religion and language made a parallel journey then?
I would say so. Yes. You have dialects and eventually different languages when it comes to language, and the same is for religion. I would say that you have a core that is similar from the beginning, that is preserved, but then you have a lot of internal development in different areas, because things develop also even if they are not influenced from the outside, but they have also been influenced by early religions and customs and rituals that were present in the different areas, because the Indo-Europeans, as far as we know, they didn't wipe out the persons that were there before. They are preserved in our genes also, so their customs were probably preserved as language, were also incorporated eventually into the specific different Indo-European context. So if you look at the Scandinavian context, for instance, as Terje Östergård and I have seen the southern Norway and southern Sweden then, and things that could be preserved there from very far back. You have, of course, the Indo-European roots, and those roots are the same as you also can see in Slavonic and also southern German and also the Latin countries of Europe. Also in India and ancient Iran, even if Iran has a more complicated later history than but things are still preserved to some extent. But in southern Scandinavia, you can also see that there are things that may not be preserved in other areas, but that should possibly be from the earlier cultural things that were dominant here, but not in other areas before the Indo-Europeans come here. And then, of course, you have a lot of development that depends on, in northern areas like Scandinavia, you have a lot of things about nature and the agriculture years and such things that accentuate some rituals that are not as important if you are in, let's say, India or somewhere in the southern Europe either.
So are there any like remnants in the rural traditions that you were talking about now? Like, are there any like things still there in the popular belief or the people? Like,
yes, I would say so. I will. That also brings me back to my childhood, because I said that I loved to listen to stories when I was little, and there was one story that I didn't in those days. I was only 5 years old when I heard it first time. It's the story about Odin's hunt. You may have heard it, the wild hunt it's called in the European context.
No, maybe, yeah. It does ring a bell right now, but
yeah. And it has been retold. I didn't know that then, because it was like a ghost story, and I loved ghost stories. And it was told like this: it was a farmer coming home late at night, and this was at Christmas time. And he was at the road, and then a naked woman come running. She had long hair, and she was screaming and was upset. And she said, "Don't tell where I'm going, because there is coming a man after me. He's coming on a horse riding, comes after me." And then she disappeared into the woods. And then just a short while later, this rider, he arrived on a black horse. He had dogs at the sides that were having fire from the mouths, and they were barking. And the horse was all black, and this man, he was like a knight. He was also he was black and had a sword by his side. And he stopped by the farmer and he said, "Did you see a woman coming here?" And this farmer, he was all terrified, and he said, so he pointed to the woods where she disappeared, even if he had promised he shouldn't do that. And the rider just get on after her, and then he heard a shot. Bam! And then the rider came back, and then he had a woman over the horse with the blood dropping from her head. And he said to the farmer, "You're lucky. If you hadn't told me the truth, you would have been there instead," he said. So, and this place was also a well-known place at home, so I know that this could happen. I was very frightened that I would meet this man sometime. But then later on, when I studied also ethnology and folkloristics in Uppsala in the 80s, I realized quite soon that this was a very well-spread story about Odin's hunt. This was not called Odin in my local tradition, it was the devil instead. But the Odin is often transferred to the devil. But this story in different shapes is told actually from India to Norway. And in the down in Central Europe, it's called the wild hunt, and it's referred to as the wild hunt. Odin is only in Scandinavia and mainly in Sweden, but and in Germany it's Wotan instead. But it's often dead warriors or dead people coming in this, not a rider, but it's very much the same story. Always happening around Christmas and in the midwinter time or winter solstice time of the year. So it's very connected to the Christmas time. And this is a story that is in many ways connected to the early Indo-Europeans.
Yeah. So how does religion then develop and change in comparison to language, would you say?
I would say that it's very similar, really, because some things are preserved, some things are developing because they are mixed with other traditions, language as religion, and also because even if you put a language and you have people living in an isolated area, it will develop over time, like creating dialects, and the same also with the rituals. But you have exceptions there, because if you look, for instance, at the Vedic traditions in India and today's Nepal that I have had the privilege to study myself also and interview people, you can see that they actually, the tradition is very, very conservative, because they have an oral tradition that is in from father to son in the Brahmin families mainly. And that is word by word. They actually have the oral tradition 3,000 years back in time, and it's absolutely the same. And they shouldn't actually read it from a textbook, because that is considered unclean. So you have to do it very, very carefully in this. So they spend years to refer this by heart from the Vedic ritual manuals. To perform different religious rituals, and also to recite more or less poems and also epic verses that tell stories about old times, but it's mainly ritual manuals it's about. And there are some signs, at least, that you also in the Scandinavian society had very much a tradition and about reciting poems, at least, and the skaldic verses and so on in a little bit the same way. And if that was actually a very old tradition also in Scandinavia, you might think that it could have been an area where you also can have, at least until the Viking period, you can have a very, very conservative tradition preserved also. We can't prove it, but there are signs that could be a possibility, at least.
So is that also like a poem-based storytelling, like oral tradition?
It is also about poems, but it's mainly ritual manuals that are in the shape of a poem.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So, because we already touched on this a little bit, but the way like the gods develop and all that stuff, like for instance, Odin, the Odin cult.
Yeah.
As we mentioned before, it's very, very older than the Viking Age, definitely. But it changed, right, when it came in contact with the Mithras cult. Or is that just a theory, or is it anything that we can prove?
It's a theory of mine.
Okay, so,
yeah,
no, I studied it.
No, I know that. Historian of religion Olof Sundqvist from Uppsala, who is in Stockholm now. We actually wrote a book 20 years ago about Odin and Mithras, and I had that idea first when studying the golden bracteates from the Bronze Age. When you look at the motif on the bracteates, it's often considered as Odin curing Balder's horse and some other. But if you look at the animal on the bracteates, you can see it's not only a horse, it has horns and it has claws in some, and it's more or less, it's like a cow or even a goat in some things. And if you look at some of the bracteates, you can see the same motif, at least if you half close your eyes, as you have in the Mitraic temples with Mithras killing the bull. It's very if you look at the iconography, it's very, very similar actually. So that was the things I was thinking. Could there be some sort of inspiration? And I never believed that it was Mithras actually that became Odin, but we looked deeper into it, and Olle or Olof then he looked at the sources of history of religion then and the ancient sources also, and I looked at archaeology. And there is actually quite a possibility that the Odin cult were inspired by this, because we know today that there were a lot of Scandinavians down taking in cultural aspects from the Romans of different kinds, not least in the military environment along the Limes probably, but also as traders. And most of the Mitraic temples, the Mitria, they were actually located along the border. So soldiers and also traders were often part in this mystical, it was secret societies more or less that you were initiated into, these Mitraic societies. And it's not at all improbable that a lot of auxiliary Scandinavians and other Germans were also part of these societies. And then they could have been inspired. We know they are inspired in many other ways, military ways. And if they brought this home, it could be like, okay, this is how the Romans actually made a brotherhood that were much stronger than even the military unit, or it was probably sometimes also the same as the military unit where you served. And then they could have made partly their own tradition out of this, and also developed it into the Nordic Odin cult that I'm quite sure was here already before, because everything speaks for that Odin was here from the beginning, so to speak. But he was probably transformed during that period.
Because I was curious about that, because sometimes you mix up it's easy to forget that, the Viking Age and the Roman Empire, they didn't really exist at the same time. So this must be like pre-Viking Age then, I would assume.
It's definitely pre-Viking Age, yes.
At least by 1,000 years, I guess.
No, but maybe a few hundred years, because the Brachtians, they are 6th century,
okay.
5th, 6th century mainly. So if it's a late Roman inspiration, it would be the same as the interpretation of the hill forts on Öland, for instance. That is...
But wouldn't the Roman Empire be Christian by that time?
It was, it was starting in the 4th century, of course, then, and then it was during the 4th century. It was both, you could say.
Oh, okay.
And the Mitraic cult, that was actually, at least some believe that it was one of the major threats towards Christianity. It was a very popular cult, not least among traders and soldiers. So it might well have been an inspiration, but then of course it was not brought to Scandinavia, but it was more or less the iconography and also maybe some parts of this secret society thing that was brought back and used in another way here, as they definitely used a lot of material culture from the Romans, weapons not least, and other things, and developed it as the Valkärrevendel helmets, like the Sappenho helmet also. That is at least one theory is that it was the late Roman cavalry helmets that were the template for this kind, but they of course very much a Nordic construction and expression, not least, but still they have some Roman things in them, and that would be the same with the Mithras thing. The strange thing with the Mithras here that Olof and I developed in that, and we actually got quite good response from a lot of researchers, really, because we are not at all pretending that Odin was Mithras or something like that, but Then we realized, but that was afterwards, that already in the 1920s, and it's often like that in research, some German historians of religion had suggested more or less the same thing.
Okay.
But that was forgotten, actually. So.
That's super interesting, though. Which kind of also brings me back to a question I kind of forgot that I wanted to ask. Maybe it's totally irrelevant in the situation. But anyways, since we touched upon Christianity now, so language and religion have, developed simultaneously in Europe with the migration of the Indo-European people, right?
Yes.
So how would you say that the old traditions and all that stuff that still live on, like when we have a religion that's more or less taught into an existing community, rather, where's the difference there? Like, what do we keep? How has Christianity become such a strong influence in Europe?
Well, I think it's actually because it's two very different things, I would say. I think that the popular belief is maybe that the Asa religion also, it was more or less the same. It was some belief that you actually came to believe in like that, but it was actually what you called in religious science an ethnic religion. You were born into it, like today's Hinduism, for instance. You don't convert mainly to it. You are, it's part of your life. And as I used to say to my students that if you would have asked the Viking Age or early Iron Age person about what religion they have, I don't think they would have understood the question really as we do it, because it was the things that everyone always had believed. That was what they believed. Of course, it was not the same thing that everybody had believed all the time, but in their parents, their grandparents, and everybody you knew and remembered, they had believed the same thing. So it was the custom that you should do. And I think the Christianity, when it comes from quite the different. It comes from the top. So but also for a very long time during the medieval period, down in the different countryside areas in Scandinavia or Northern Europe, I'm quite convinced that people still believed the same things. I mean, what do we believe when we put the porridge to the elf or tomten in Sweden on Christmas Eve? That is actually one of the dead forefathers in the ground that you put some sacrifice out to. And if you go only a few hundred years back, you have a lot of such customs that the church were not actually actively trying to put an end to it. That was only after the Reformation, in the Lutheran times in Scandinavia, from the 17th century onwards, it was much harder. But a lot of things were preserved and are still preserved until the late 19th, early 20th century, if you look at it. That could be traced back to the old religion. So when people ask me, how do you think that the Scandinavian religion were performed, or rituals were performed, I say, look at the countryside. When you look at the ethnography, folkloristic things, and the wise people that you had that are called witches and other things during the 17th, 18th century, I think you have a lot of the answers there, actually. It's not sanctioned anymore, but it's so deep beliefs that they were not created during Christian times. They were preserved despite of the Christian layer that was put atop.
Yeah, because that's the way I feel about it, is that we do still, even though maybe not as much as maybe like a few hundred years ago, but we do still have some of the traditions and customs that our Viking Age ancestors had. We still have them, even though we have a new, like, general religious belief in Scandinavia. So it's interesting that when it comes from the top down, you can't really erase the fundamentals, basically, of the original belief. Would you agree with me on that?
I definitely agree on that. And I think one reason is also, if you look at the Christian missionaries, where it all started, and also in the continental Europe, they actually had the advice not to be too harsh and to try to erase the old traditions, try to incorporate them as much as it was possible. And I think that is also the reason why you have the churches on the old cultic places. I
was just going to say that.
You have Fröslunda Church. What is that the name? I mean, it's a heathen cultic name. It's really strange that they agreed that could be a church name, and there are a lot of them like that, like Harj in Östergötland and other places. And that is strange. And one theory is that they put them there to erase and take away the old religion. But why did it keep the names in that way? I think it's a lot of things that the early Catholic medieval church in Sweden, they actually they didn't care that people had this as long as they officially was part of the church and the country was part of the church. That was okay.
Yeah. So going back now to what we were talking about a little bit before, that was kind of a sidetrack, I guess. So what? Well, actually, kind of is connected. What Viking Age rituals can be traced back to the Indo-Europeans then?
What kind of?
What Viking Age rituals? Like, are there any specific ones, or like?
I would say the horse sacrifices, of course. We don't know so much about how they were performed, but they are mentioned, of course. And you have, the most famous is in the Snorre saga, the Håkon, the saga of Håkon the Good, the Norwegian Christian king, when he was performing the blot in Trøndelag at Mære, the blot at Mære in Trøndelag in Norway, where the people were not Christian yet, and he was a Christian king coming there, and he had to perform the blot with the horse sacrifice. And he refused to eat the horse meat first, and then he took in the steam from the boiling horse meat in the mouth, and that was enough, they thought. But when he came back to the Christmas or the Juleblot, the midwinter blot, then they were much more hard on him, so he had to do it. And then he actually also took a bite in the horse meat, and then they were satisfied. But of course, it was a lot of turbulence. They threatened to kill the king or put him off the throne if he didn't eat the horse meat. So you can see how important the horse meat is. And the horse sacrifice and the horse as a sacred animal, that goes from the earliest Indo-European things. You have it in India. You have the most famous of all horse sacrifices, the Asvamedha sacrifice, where the horse sacrifice is performed as a very important sacrifice. That is a royal sacrifice that has not been carried out in later centuries, but it's very well described, and it has a very important cosmological significance. And of course, that is only one. But it shows from India to Scandinavia, and not least also in other parts of Europe when it comes to remains of horse sacrifice, that the horse is actually a very important sacrificial animal. And that goes, I would say, back to both the Asvins, the twin gods in shape of horses that were driving the sun chariot. That was, of course, the force behind all kind of fertility and the day and night and the seasons and so on.
Yeah. But isn't that like a little bit peculiar that became such a strong tradition in Scandinavia and Norway in particular, in a way, because we weren't really people who rode a lot of horses here?
That is, I know there is this picture that the Vikings, they were not riding people, and of course they were not if they were sea.
Although obviously the ships were called seahorses.
They were called seahorses, so I think. But if you go a little bit further back in time to the migration and the Roman period, the Scandinavians were definitely horse people also. So I think I'm a little bit reluctant to believe that there were not horse people during the Viking Age, but maybe not the same, because it's like if they were more or less the people on the seahorses, there were the Marines, but maybe you had a cavalry troop also in other aspects of the Viking society, really, because it's hard to believe that this quite strong cavalry tradition that seems to have been here during the early Iron Age or Roman period, migration period, that should disappear altogether. I don't really think so.
I mean, the horse on Iceland obviously became immensely important and still is to the Icelandic people. But I would assume, like Sweden with the massive forests and then Norway with all the mountains, it would be difficult to maintain like a cavalry tradition.
In part of Sweden, but you have the cavalry tradition in later periods, actually, like in Västergötland, Östergötland, with the plain lands, where you also in later centuries had the main areas for the cavalry in the Swedish army when they had cavalry then. Those areas were famous also for horse breeding until late, actually, until the 19th century. And you also have it on Öland, for instance, where you had a very special horse, a very small horse that was called the Öland horse, that it's extinct today, actually. You have one photo of Öland horse. It was a very small pony, actually.
Oh, okay.
But Öland is famous for until the reign of Gustav Vasa in the 16th century, when he stopped the farmers' trade with the European continent from Öland, directly from Öland. Until then, they were famous for exporting horses towards. And Ulf Erik Hagberg, who was a Swedish archaeologist and head of the Historical Museum in the 90s, he actually wrote his thesis about Skede Mosse. That's a famous horse sacrifice place on Öland, on eastern Öland, from the Roman and migration period mainly, with a lot of fancy materials, a lot of gold finds, and also horses mainly. And Skede, that is, the name is indicating also a place for horse races and horse fights of ritual kind that was probably ending up in the sacrifice then. And from this area it was exported a lot of horses until the medieval period, at least, and it was an area that was also famous for breeding horses. So I think that they had such a tradition. And at least the traditions, the ritual traditions concerning horses, they are very much preserved in Östergötland, where I come from, not least, but also in southern Norway, in even stronger traditions, where you have this horse fight, the sked, that's called, is the same word as skede, as I just mentioned, on Skede Mosse, old word then for horse fights, stallion fight. And in southern Norway, in Setesdal mainly, that is such a relict area, until the 19th century, they have these horse fights. They were very, very violent. In the intermediate period between summer and winter, in September, all people gathered for a festivity where they had this fight between to find the best stallion in the villages. And the stallions were made to fight each other over a mare that was held back, and the two people were holding back the mare and from the stallions, and the stallions were fighting until the one was successful and won, but he didn't get the mare. Then either he had to take the next stallion and then the next, and the last standing stallion would have to could have the mare. And that was, of course, a practical thing, because the best stallion should breed with the mare, but it was also a fertility ritual that goes very, very far back. You have it also in Iceland earlier, and you had it in Sweden also, we know that. And that is one of the things that's possibly going back very far in time. You have it in a lot of other traditions also. When we approach Christmas now on Lucia, and also in other parts of Christmas, because it's a lot of mixed traditions during Christmas, coming from the calendar reforms in the 18th century and so on. But you have this tradition of horses on Lucia next Friday, the 13th of December, where you sing songs about Staffan and so on, and his horses and his riding. And that is also a reminder of the horse races that were so important. They had them mainly on the day after Christmas Day in the morning, where all farmers in the village should race their horses towards a wellspring that was running towards north. And the first stallion that came there, he should drink of the water. And that farmer had the best luck for the next year. In Flista socken, that is close to where I come from in Östergötland, where they have this very strong horse tradition up to late, actually. They had such a well is still preserved, actually. And the Flista well is well described also in folkloristic theses and so on. And there they had this kind of race until the 19th century. And it was not only that the first one should have the best luck for his farm, but he also won the loser's stallion. So it was very, very, very bad to come last.
Oh, quite
sure.
If you ain't first, you're last.
Yeah.
All right. So let's dive into this now, because he was also researched wolf warriors.
Yes, warriors.
And I realize now that maybe I should have worn my wolf hidden t-shirts instead of the berserker. But yeah, they kind of correlate in a way. I know that, but we'll talk about that later. But wolf warriors appear all across Europe, both as werewolf myths, and in Scandinavia in the shape of the wolf hidden, like I just mentioned. So let's dive into it. Where should we start with this?
Yes, it's of course the things with Koryos that I first mentioned, the Indo-European warriors, because it's in a lot of old sources. You have the description of these kind of warriors, that they were actually transforming into a state where they thought themselves to be partly wolves or dogs, also war dogs or wolves, but in some cases also other animals. Maybe also the berserker comes in that part. And this you have from India to Scandinavia, then the Ulfhedna berserker, that is very, very, very famous. And you also have it in a lot of traditions from continental Europe, from the southern German parts, from where you have it in this myth about the wild hunt that I were discussing. Because this kind of initiated warriors that were living, the young warriors that were living outside society, when they got into this stage, living as this Koryos, this band of young warriors living outside society, they were believed to be partly wolves or other animals. And when they got to war, they got into this state, this furious state, where they also took on partly the shape of the wolf. That was at least the belief. So they became more or less a werewolf, you could say, in that stage. But they were not only fierce animals, they were also partly the dead warriors that had been before them, because being part of this outside society warrior society, they took on the shape or the spirits of the dead warriors, or the dead warriors were among them. So it was believed that the dead warriors were also part of the strength, and this is probably also the way we should believe the Ulfhedna and berserker then. But if you come in the later periods, like the Viking age, this had been probably more formalized, that they were certain warriors that were serving a chief or maybe a king or something, like part of his elite soldiers. But in the original shape, it was an initiation into the Indo-European societies. And this personification with wolves that has been mirrored also by a very interesting archaeological find that is quite early, that was made by one of the most renowned Indo-European archaeologists of today, David Anthony, who is an American professor of archaeology from New York. He was excavating in southern Russia in the 90s, and in a place called Krasnosamorsk, that is near Samara in southern Russia. He excavated such an initiation place. It was interpreted as an initiation place for such warriors, where they found a very, very strange sacrificial place for dogs and wolves. The skulls of dogs and wolves that were cut up in very, very special formalistic ways. And it was carried out during midwinter. That was apparent from the context and from analyses that were made from paleoecological things and so on. And of course, you can't 100%, as always in archaeology, prove that this was such a place, but it matches very well this. It was from the Srubnaya culture, that is one of the Bronze Age cultures that is very, very close to the original Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya, and the later so-called Sintashta culture that is also part of this, but it's a lot of cultural names for Indo-Europeans on the steppe, so we can leave that here. But this is, of course, a very rare find, but it's one archaeological proof that there was something behind this, and that it's the dogs and wolves here that is the interesting thing, of course.
So this was like an initiation rite into manhood, right?
Yes.
But there are also other myths, like old legends of children being raised by wolves. Does that have the same cultural background as these rituals?
It might well have, because these kind of bands, they were, of course, had to be loyal to their own society, because they shouldn't attack them, of course. That would have been disastrous, because they should live out and learn a lot of things, live out all kind of bad things and come back as normal people then a few years later, if they came back. But towards other societies and other people in the surrounding, they could behave as they wanted. So it's believed that they probably took women from other tribes, and possibly also children. And of course they murdered, and they probably raped, and they also took the cattle, because that is a very, very prominent feature in this. It's cattle raiding. That is considered to be one of the main factors that they were renowned for, these kind of bands. In the original concept, they took the conquering tribes' cattle, and they took their women, and they possibly took their land also. And of course, then we are back to this expansion question, because that is, of course, one of the theories behind how the Indo-Europeans very quickly could conquer and come to other areas. Because we know, even if they within 1 or 2 generations come from the steppes in the east towards today's Germany and also Jutland in Denmark, we see that it's more or less only men that come in the first wave. But they apparently marry, or what you would call it in those days, they have children with local women. And that would, of course, fit this pattern very, very well, because we know from later periods when, for instance, in ancient Greece, you have, like in Sparta, that is a version of this warrior societies also, where the young men live outside society for a while. You have it also in Greece when they send out people to create colonies around the Mediterranean Sea. You could see it as the same kind of pattern, where people actually settle down in another area. They don't come back to their own society. They settle in a new, and they create a new society. And that is believed to be possibly the fate of some of these early Koryos groups, that most of them, of course, came back as full-grown men and initiated back into society, living in their old tribe as grown-up men, creating families there. But some of them were probably not coming back. Some died, definitely, and some were probably staying in the foreign areas where they arrived, and then they took local women. They created their own new society that was also Indo-European, of course.
So perhaps we shouldn't interpret that Mowgli was actually raised by actual wolves. He was raised by Corius. I'm just spitballing it.
Could be the case, but
Yeah. So why wolves? Why would they choose the wolf? I mean, a bear, I would assume, is just as ferocious. It's bigger, more powerful.
I think it's actually not that exclusively wolves. It's also dogs, that I said. Even,
Oh, yeah.
And it's not kind of the small Spitz dog that I have. The Pomeranian type is not that kind. It's much more fierce dogs than warrior dogs. But there are also mentioned other. So bears are also mentioned, and other wild animals. So it's not exclusively wolves, but I think in human history the wolves has a very special role as the personification of curiosity and warriorhood, and also of evil in some ways.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think the wolves were a preferred animal, but not exclusively wolf. But of course, how comes the werewolves in this? Well, it is, I mean, the werewolf belief of later times is very much from the Christian, it's Christianized more or less. So, I mean, it's often people turn into werewolves more or less for the same reason why they become vampires, maybe in other stories. And it's not that very big difference between werewolves and vampires in some European stories either, but that's another story. But from my perspective, very convincing theory is that the werewolves are originally referring to these kind of groups.
Yeah.
Because these kind of warriors, we have them briefly described. It's believed by Tacitus that is 98 after in our time period, 98 AD, when he writes his Germania, the book about the German people of believed to be northern Germany today. Not so much Scandinavia probably, but it's the same kind of people then. And he describes people he calls Hari, that is only interpreted as warriors. So it was probably a warrior group that was part of the Lugians or other people that are believed to live in Western Carpathians or the Sudeten in today's Czech Republic or somewhere in that area. It's mainly believed. And the Hari, they were black shields, and they had their bodies painted black, and they were attacking at night, also scaring other people that it was actually not real humans. They were the dead people that were attacking. So it's a very good description of how these Corius groups probably performed their attacks, and how they used both weapons and the warrior skills, but also the trick that they were actually not only human, they were also part of the dead warriors, so they were more or less immortal. And of course, if you read the Tolkien with the dead warriors in the mountain, and you see the movie, of course that refers to the same things, that it was believed that also dead warriors could come back and help these kind of groups to achieve their goals.
Yeah. I'm actually really curious about that they were painted in black and they rode at night, which relates a little bit to that story, the Odin's hunt that you were talking about before.
Yes.
So, and the dogs with the fire-breathing mouths. That's very, very, very interesting. So that story has traveled, but were they then connected to Odin or a similar god, would you say?
I think they were. They were probably connected to Odin as the god of curiosity and the god of war and the warrior concept. But of course, as you know, Odin has a much broader spectrum, but it's not really necessary something that stands against the other. So, but I think they were connected to him. But if you see the same story, the wild hunt in a broader perspective, because the Odin is most frequent in the Scandinavian and Swedish traditions and some part of Germany, but a much more common version of this is that it's old dead warriors that come. It could be a whole army coming, and that story is also present in Sweden, and sometimes it takes on much later events. There is one from Hunneberg in Västergötland that is not well. It's a bit east from here, but it's in middle Sweden, western middle Sweden, you could say, where the local belief was that in Hunneberg there was a whole army that was kept inside the mountain, and that was the riding warriors that came home after the Battle of Breitenfeld in the 30-Year War in 1631, where people were saying that the dead warriors, a few days after, when they heard about the battle, it was a victory for the Swedish army, but a lot of people died, of course. Then the riders of the Västgöta cavalry regiment, they were coming home as dead and riding into, and they heard at night when they rode into the mountain. And that is, you have the similar thing from some German mountains, for instance, in Harz and in Schwarzwald also. And so it's definitely the same story that also take on a local and also a historical other clothes, but it's the same core of the story.
I don't know why, but I also had this notion of the myth of the headless rider.
Yeah, that's the same. It's the same actually. Yeah. So it's spread to the States also, where this so it's a concept that has a lot of different. It disguises in different ways, but it's the same story in the core, actually.
So what other cultures have traces of this myth?
You have it,
or this myth is maybe not, but this concept of Corius.
The myth that goes about the cattle raiding, for instance, that has its most long-lasting tradition on Ireland, actually, where you have this cattle raiding tradition that is documented from at least the 18th century also, where the young men actually made this as a sport, probably, but also possibly to keep the cattle that they were raiding, and also
they have a lot of cattle.
They have a lot of cattle, yeah. So, and of course the Celtic and later on the Irish traditions they are of course one version of that preserves a lot of early Indo-European things. It's believed. So,
but can you see like the tradition of the Corius, like in Rome, like Roman culture or Greek culture? Well, you already mentioned Sparta, of course. But.
Yes, definitely in Greek culture, where you have it, the Sparta is the most classical example, but there are others also that they had this kind of initiation rites for young men. And you have it partly like this real traditions, but you also have it in the mythology. Then you have that also in India, actually, where we have the wild hunting that is intermixed also with the description of the earliest Vedic warriors that were actually making the conquering of northern India more than 3,000 years ago, where they are also described in the same way as the Indic version of the wild hunt that is actually preserved in very, very similar ways as the European ones.
So, thinking of this, you already touched upon this, because Scandinavia have a very special... damn it. I lost where I was going to say. Anyways, Scandinavia in a way was, I guess, is the last bastion of these beast warriors. Would you say?
Yeah, I think so, at least as far as we know. And in that, very, very, very characteristic shape, because I mean the Ulfhednar as described, or the Berserker, and I think we shouldn't distinguish too much between them, because I at least my feeling is they are more or less the same concept, but connected to different fierce animals. I think that is one of the best descriptions, and they are of course very late, at least as such. But if you want to make the long durée in this, and of course you could see also that later European traditions, even actually military services of later periods, where young men go into the military service for part of some years and going back. Of course, it doesn't necessarily be an Indo-European thing, but it could all the same be reflecting very, very deep thoughts of how things should be. Everybody should be part of this, and then they should go back. And if you don't do it, you are not actually a full-grown member. Then, I mean, in many European societies, that was. Even when I was young, that was the way they described. People didn't like to go to the military service, but they had to do it. And if you didn't do it, then you were not.
Yeah, in many ways, people say that if like you go to the military, they will make a man of you.
Yes, and I think that expression maybe was the same. But of course, it's very far-fetched to say that that is an original Indo-European trait. But you should never say never, because things are very much reflecting things. Even if they could develop out of nowhere, they could also actually be part of this tradition. Very little, but still.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, we already talked about this. That you talk about ages being like maybe like things happening 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. There's a big time span, obviously, but evolutionary and mentally, we're not that different from the people living like 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. So possibly the same mental image of to become a man, you have to go through this rite of passage, and the military service could definitely be that. I guess.
Yes, and definitely. And of course, a lot of things. If my theories about these deep structures that are actually originally Indo-European, that is preserved under the surface in virtually all European and some other areas of the world, and in later periods, depending on the spread of European people, much larger areas. But if that is correct, then of course such more subtle things could also be part of it. Why did it develop in Europe in that way? Why did we have military service in those ways? Why not in some other? Why not professional armies? Maybe there was practical reasons, because they wanted mass armies in the 19th century. But still, it might have been something that was very easy to reactivate in the culture, actually.
Yeah. It's something very Jungian about that, with the collective consciousness and all that stuff.
Yeah, I must admit that I have quite a high respect of Jung, actually, because I think that, and if you read Jung, it was interesting also because that was one of the first times before actually I read folkloristics at university. I read about Jung had also an experience of the wild hunt.
Oh, really?
Yes, when you were at his country place, I think, or and then during this period when he had a lot of spooky things, the dead came back and so on. So, and he wrote a book about that. And then he also had this experience, and then it was actually the dead people coming around the house, and you could hear them, and they passed by. And that is an original story from Switzerland, Austria, and so on, also connected mainly to midwinter, so the winter solstice and the Christmas time. You have another very special tradition from southern Germany, Austria, that is actually connected, and that is the Krampus.
Oh yeah,
thing.
of course.
The Krampuslauf or the Krampus run, that was it was on the 5th, 6th of December. And if you see how that is carried out in Austria today, where you have these carnival-like things where people go with masks and very, very dressed up in animal or beastly-like costumes. And then they actually, as I read in the paper this year, that there were some incidents where they had attacked the audience and they drink too much, and it's always like that. and this Krampus thing, that is also connected to this actually, because
But aren't there more goats? I mean, I assume that the wild hunt included horses more.
they include, in some traditions, they include a lot of strange things actually, because they include the dead, and mainly the badly dead people, and also all kind of strange things. And in one version that is very similar to the southern German that is preserved in Norway, where they call it the julreia, or the Oscarreia, that's part of the Norwegian, the Asgard's reia, that's the travel of the Aesir, or the travel of the Yule people. And in that tradition, it's a lot of the evil spirits and evil dead persons, and also some monsters, and also werewolves and other things. They go around outside the farm in the Christmas night, and you shouldn't go out then because they are there. And there is also creatures that are dressed like the goat. Our Christmas goat is a part of that.
Yeah.
You can see really monstrous examples of Christmas goats also preserved in. There is a couple of examples from Norway, I know that, and one from Småland also, where you have it. And they are extremely similar to the Krampus version that is still...
And in Finland, actually, Santa Claus is still called the Christmas goat.
Yes.
Joulupukki.
Joulupukki, yes, yes. And of course, the Christmas goat was a much bigger part of the Swedish Yule tradition before we had this Santa Claus version, Tomten, today. But Tomten, as you know, that was something quite different in the old Swedish traditions.
I know that very well, from my grandmother especially. She was an old farm lady, and she told me all about Tomten. She really still believed that they lived on her farm.
I have the same experience actually, and of course things are preserved very long. I mean, I'm a little bit older. I'm born in 1963. My father was born in 1925, and my grandfather was born in 1880. And his grandfather, as he knew as a child, he was born in 1798. So, and I mean, on a farm in those days, things were preserved very. So, I mean, the step back to the Viking period is not so far as people often believe, actually.
It's not far at all. I actually, I haven't been there myself, but my wife went to a place in the Finnmark on the way up to Sveg.
Yes.
Called Fågelsjö. There's an actual 18th century farm where the people who owned it, they built a new house, and they just left the farm the way it was with all the stuff in it. So you can go there and look at it. It's I've seen pictures of it. It is amazing because it's preserved just as they left it.
Wonderful.
And it really, like, you can really tell that it's not that far, like technology wise, to the Viking Age.
No.
And it's amazing to see. So yeah, it is very fascinating. Amazing.
It's very complicated to explain, because it's so many threads from different angles and in different time periods that are intermingled. And when I try to describe that, I understand that it could be many times very hard to see the clear line between the early Indo-Europeans and the later things. When you dive into it and you see all the things that are actually so similar and connected, not one by one, but when you put 10 or 20 or 50 aspects together, then you become much more convinced about this actually. And of course, I'm happy today to work in this period, because when I started, as I said, it was very, very unpopular to talk about the Indo-Europeans. And for a long time it had been since the Second World War, when it was so badly used by the Nazi researchers.
Yeah, because you talked about the Aryans. So we actually kind of missed the opportunity to go into that. But
Aryans, yes.
Yeah, but what were the Aryans originally?
Yes, that is really interesting, and the Aryans were actually something originally, because that was the Arya is the word that the Indo-Europeans used for themselves when entering India and Iran more than 3,000 years ago. Then, and that is preserved in both in the word Iran today. That is actually the area of the Aryans. So Irania, that's the area land. And area is also the things that the Indo-Europeans call themselves in the Vedic scripts of ancient India. So that was actually used first by linguists to describe, of course, that kind of people. But then in the early 19th century, by then Gordon Childe that I mentioned, he was, I think, the first to introduce it in the 1920s into archaeology, and that was actually quite by the opposite reason compared to how it has been interpreted later, because he wanted to have something that was not called Indo-Germanen, was often the word that was used in those days, something that were behind both the Indo-Iranians and the Germanic people of Europe. And he wanted something else, and he thought that Aryans could be a good way to have a more original and also neutral concept. But then, of course, when the Germans during the Third Reich period in Germany, with the SS Ahnenerbe and Heinrich Himmler's researchers, and that were trying to find the origin of the Germanic people that were made equivalent to the Aryan people, then it was, of course, definitely ruined this Aryan concept. So today, if you mentioned Aryan, it's mainly associated, of course, with race biology and misuse of. But originally, it was quite a good concept, and Gordon Childe was definitely not a Nazi himself. He was a Marxist archaeologist.
Okay, yeah.
So
it's about as far away from that you can come, I guess.
Yeah.
So, very fascinating stuff. I think we should round it off there. It's been amazing talking to you, but we always end our show with this way. But I know that maybe Viking Age is not your particular interest in that sense, but if you could be a fly on the wall in the Viking Age or some part of the Indo-European migration, what specifically would you like to witness?
Oh, that's.
Is there anything?
If I go to only the Viking Age, then I think the thing that pop up first is the thing that I actually mentioned about Håkon, the saga of Håkon the Good, the Norwegian king with his horse sacrifice, because I would like to see that scene myself, actually, that Snorri describes. Was it like that, and how did they interpret this with the horse sacrifice? Why was it so important? Well, what would they have told me about it? So that if I as a fly could ask them also, that would be even better.
Okay. Well, you don't have to be a fly. You can just go back and ask them, I guess.
Yes.
But would you have wanted to live in those days?
No, I don't think so. I think it would be hard for anyone, almost anyone living today, to be in those days. Actually, I think so. I'm quite satisfied to study it. I feel that's my part of it.
I think, and I kind of always end it this way. I've said this many times before, but I think it depends on if I moved from this age to then.
Yeah,
I would not.
No,
definitely not.
If you were born into it, it was probably
then you wouldn't know anything else.
No, you wouldn't know anything. And if you ask the same thing about the 17th century central Sweden, I think I wouldn't actually be there either. So.
No, it's pretty horrible. Probably. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you here and pleasure talking to you. So much interesting stuff. I think probably we didn't even scratch the surface of all your knowledge, but it was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here eventually. I tried to get here earlier, but I didn't success that time. But now I'm here.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that bell button.